Welcome to our Stronghold Iron 8-step video installation series. Roll up your sleeves and get ready to work. Today we tackle step number 4, digging your post holes. Hey everyone, Jason from Iron Fence Shop. In step 3, we used our post spacing calculations and marked where our post holes will go in our yard. In step 4 of our Stronghold Iron video installation series, we're going to go over calculating and digging your post holes. So if you're using our surface mount flange posts, you can skip ahead to the next video. If you're concreting your posts in the ground, then stick around. There's a lot to review in this one, but making sure we take all this into account now ensures we won't run into issues later in the installation. Today's video is going to break down into 4 parts. In part 1, we'll discuss some special post installation considerations to be aware of before calculating and digging your post holes. In part 2, we'll go over how to calculate your post hole width. Yep, that's right, more math fun. In part 3, we'll go over how to calculate your post hole depth, also more math fun. And in final part 4, we'll get into some tips on digging the post holes. Everything we go over today will remain the same whether you're digging post holes manually or using a rented power auger / post hole digging machine. Unless you have a very small project, I would highly recommend renting some kind of powered machine from Home Depot or a local tool rental store that just about every city has. I'm especially fond of the ones with tracks you can drive around or the one-man versions that drop with a counterweight. Not only will renting one save you time, but also a lot of physical work. Before we get into post hole calculations and digging, let's roll to part 1 and review some special post installation considerations to be aware of. These special considerations revolve around changes in elevation such as slopes, hills, and dips in the yard that may affect your post hole depth calculations. If your yard is fairly flat and level, then post hole depth is going to remain the same throughout the layout. However, there are a couple situations where that's not going to hold true and needs to be taken into consideration before you calculate your post hole depths. If your yard is fairly level and you're just dealing with a slight dip in the yard, then just be sure to account for it in the low spot's post hole depth calculation. In our little example here, we have a 3-inch dip in the yard where one of our posts will land. We are installing a 5-foot tall fence panel with a 3-inch gap underneath and 8-foot long posts. As you'll see a little later in the video as we get into the calculations, this means that 5 foot 3 inches of the 8-foot long post is above ground and 2 foot 9 inches of the post is buried in the ground. For a small dip like this, we're just going to keep the tops of the post even and just let there be a larger gap under the panel in the low spot. So to compensate for that, we're going to add the 3-inch dip to the amount of post above ground and subtract it away from the amount of post below ground. So our 2 outer posts on level ground will have 2 foot 9 inch deep post holes. For our post landing in the dip, we're going to take that 3-inch dip away from the post hole depth and add it above ground. So for our post in the dip, 5 foot 6 inches of post is exposed above ground, and our post hole depth is adjusted to 2 foot 6 inches buried below ground. If you have a situation like this in your yard, make sure to note it on your fence plan so you know to modify your post depth calculations that we review later in the video. Now, before you get too worried that you have to account for every tiny dip and hump in the yard, know that there is some wiggle room to work around this. I can guarantee you that no one's yard is laser level perfect and that the pros do not anguish over every little change in yard elevation for customer installations. If you just have an isolated dip in the yard, now might be a good time to get some soil and level it out. If you just have a small hump to deal with, now may be the time to shave it down level with the rest of the yard. Moving some dirt beforehand can sometimes be easier and look better than trying to make the fence follow small dips and humps all over the place. If you're worried that your modified post hole depth is going to be too shallow in our little example, dig it to the same 2 foot 9 inch depth as the rest of the posts and put 3 inches of gravel in the bottom of the hole to get those extra 3 inches of post out of the ground. You can get away with a fence post or two being a little shallower in ground to compensate for height changes. Just try not to end up with less than 18 to 20 inches of concrete footing and maybe dig those shallower post holes a little wider. I even have some customers and installers purposely set their posts higher out of the ground than they want the final height to be. Before they put their post caps on, they go back and cut all the post top level with the top of their installed fence panels and deal with yard variations that way. If you go that route, just make sure that option is not making your post hole too shallow for the fence. The post caps are typically your best way to compensate for small height variances between posts. These ball caps add anywhere from 3 to 4 inches of height to the post when you add them on top. Even if you're using our standard post cap, it will add 3/4 inch to the installed post height. As you'll see later in the video, this is why we recommend not factoring the cap height into your post depth and panel installation. The goal is to have your installed fence panel or gate not be taller than the post with your cap on. So that range of wiggle room can be from here without the cap to 3 to 4 inches taller here with the post cap on. However you decide to handle these small yard variances, just don't get lost in the weeds worrying about every little dip and bump in your yard. Just do your best to identify significant ones and plan for them in your installation. If you are dealing with a longer and constant slope in your yard and using our standard iron panels, you likely talked with us about what's called stair-step installation. In this method, the panels are height staggered like a set of stairs down the slope. When you stair-step install a fence, we need to be careful to account for that constant drop in elevation so that the amount of post out of ground is tall enough to connect with the fence panel on the higher and lower ground ends. This change or drop per panel is known as the rise over run number and should have been discussed back during the order process. If you didn't calculate a rise over run number back in the order process, check out the video link in the description below about how to do so, since you will need that measurement to help calculate your post depth later on. Your local climate, the height of your panel, the amount of slope can all affect what the best approach will be for stair-stepping your fence. If you're unsure how to proceed or didn't bring it up during the order process, watch that video to get your rise over run number and then give us a call or shoot us an email to discuss. Let's take a look at some stair-step examples and how they'll affect your post depth calculations later in the video. Here we have a 4-foot tall fence with a desired 3-inch gap underneath, and they're using 7-foot long posts. So that means on the flat area at the top of the slope, there is 4 foot 3 inches of post above ground and 2 foot 9 inches of post below ground. Our rise over run number for the slope here is 4 inches over the 8-foot run of the panel. So we need to compensate for that 4-inch height difference between the uphill post and next downhill post. Since it's a pretty mild 4-inch drop, we could split the difference and have our downhill post be 2 inches lower than our uphill post. That allows the post to step down the hill with the fence. So we add 2 inches to the amount of post above ground and subtract it from the amount of post below ground. For our downhill post here, we will leave 4 foot 5 inches of post above ground and have a slightly shallower 2 foot 7 inches of post buried below ground. When calculating these step post depths, you want to make sure that enough post remains out of ground for the fence panel's upper rail to connect. The top of our fence panel is 4 foot 3 inches above ground at the top of the hill. If we add that 4-inch drop to that number, that means that the fence panel will be 4 foot 7 inches above ground on the downhill end. So now the top of the fence is 2 inches taller than the post where they meet. Since this is a panel with the upper rail 6 inches below the finial tips, this is not an issue. The rail will still connect to the post. But had this been a flat top panel with the rail at the top, then it would have been an issue. So you need to be careful to compensate for that kind of thing depending on your panel style. While we only have 4 foot 5 inches of post above ground, keep in mind that is without the cap on the post too. When I add the ball cap on top of the post, it'll add 3 inches to the installed height of my post. So now my post with the cap added on is 4 foot 8 inches tall above ground, and the top of my fence is 1 inch below the cap at 4 foot 7 inches tall above ground. Another option is using a longer post. If we gave you longer posts for your stair-step areas, it could have been for 2 reasons. The first is that bringing more post out of the ground left you with too shallow of a post hole due to your rise over run number or local freeze line. So we gave you a longer post that allows you to maintain that same post hole depth, but still allow for more post out of the ground. The second reason may have been the customer wanting to set the post tall and then go back and cut the post to the height they want after the panels are installed, but before the post caps are fixed. This method does require cutting the post after they are set, but gives more wiggle room in the post depth and panel placement on the post. Let's look at that second option with the longer posts. Again, we have a 4 foot tall fence with a desired 3-inch gap underneath, and they're using 8 foot tall posts down the hill. At the top of the slope, we're going to use our same 7 foot long post from before. So it has 4 foot 3 inches of post above ground and 2 foot 9 inches of post below ground. On our downhill post here, we have a larger 7-inch rise over run change to follow, and we'll use the 8 foot long post going down the slope. We will maintain the same 2 foot 9 inch post hole depth that our 8 foot posts that we used with the 7 foot long post in the level area at the top of the hill. Subtracting that 2 foot 9 inches from our 8 foot tall post leaves 5 foot 3 inches of post above ground on our 8 foot tall slope post. Our installed 4 foot tall fence panel with a 3-inch gap at the top of the hill will be an installed fence panel height of 4 foot 3 inches tall. If we add the 7-inch rise over run drop to that for the downhill post, that means that the installed height of that fence panel is now 4 foot 10 inches above ground on the downhill post. Now, you can choose to trim the post to the height you want. If you wanted to line up even with the fence panel before putting the post cap on, then you would trim that 5 foot 3 inches above ground to 4 foot 10 inches above ground. If you wanted to put the 3-inch tall ball cap on the post and have it line up with the top of the fence panel, then you would trim the post to 4 foot 7 inches tall, so it was 4 foot 10 inches tall with the 3-inch ball cap on top of it. With stair-step fence installations, you have a little more leeway in how the post height relates to the installed fence panel. Some folks will have the post with the cap affixed be the same height as the fence. Others will have the post with the cap affixed be slightly shorter to go down the hill. Some trying to line it all up the same as standard fence panels with the top of the fence lining up to the top of the post without the cap on. All of those and everything in between are acceptable. The key thing you want to make sure does not happen is the post is too short on the downhill end for the top fence rail to attach to it. Be especially careful of this on flat top style panels where you don't have this leeway between the top of the fence rail and the finial tip. If you're using our racking iron panels to go down the slope, you may still need to slightly stair-step your panels if the rise over run measurement exceeds the amount the panel can rack. So if you have a 20-inch drop over 6 feet and the racking panel can only follow up to a 15-inch drop, then you need to account for the 5-inch variance by using one of those methods we just reviewed for your post depth to both rack and step your panel down the slope. Okay, with our special post installation considerations taken into account, we can now get our calculators and roll into part 2, calculating the width of your post hole. The calculation for your post hole width is pretty simple. To get your post hole width, you simply multiply the post size by 3 to get your minimum post hole diameter. So if you have all 2.5-inch size posts, you would simply multiply 2.5 inches by 3 to get a 7.5-inch minimum post hole width. Take note, that is the minimum post hole width number. You can go wider than that to match an auger size or to add extra reinforcement, but do not go smaller than that number. The 3x multiplier is a good rule of thumb, but there are some instances where making a wider hole does make sense. If you dig down and hit a root or rock that you can't get past, and that depth is shallower than you wanted the post hole to be, then you can widen the post hole so that the wider base makes up for the lack of depth. Some other situations where we recommend going beyond the 3x multiplier is with wider and heavier gate leafs. Listed here are some examples where I may advise someone to go beyond the 3x multiplier for their post hole width. These aren't 100% hard and fast rules, but are some decent guidelines to consider. A wider post hole with more concrete for gates can help stabilize and keep the post foundation from shifting over time. Gate posts have to deal with swing movement and leverage force that stationary fence posts do not. So a little extra post hole width for gate posts can be beneficial. If you aren't sure if you should go with a wider post hole than the 3x multiplier rule of thumb, give us a call or shoot us an email and we can weigh in on what post hole width we think you should go with. It's rare that more concrete in a wider hole is a bad thing outside of a little more work and a little more concrete to buy. Now that we know how wide our post hole needs to be, we can roll into part 3, calculating your post hole depth. Now that you've calculated how wide your post hole will need to be, the next step will be to calculate how deep your post hole will need to be. Post hole depth requires a lot more info and planning than the post hole width. If you have a 4-foot tall fence and a 7-foot long post, that does not mean you are burying 3 foot of post in ground. There are 5 bits of information that you will need to know in advance of the post hole depth calculation. Item 1 is the height of your fence or gate. If you aren't sure of that, it's on your order confirmation. Item number 2 is the length of your posts. This will also be on your order confirmation. Be sure to check if all your post lengths are the same. Sometimes gate posts, especially those for larger gates, may be wider and longer than your fence panel posts. Item 3 is the gap or distance from the bottom of your fence and gate to the ground. Item 4 is how much post you want above your fence or gate without the post cap installed. And rounding things out with item number 5 is if any of those special considerations we reviewed in part 1 will affect some of your post hole depth calculations in the layout. These 5 bits of information will be used to calculate how much of our post will be above ground and how deep we need to dig the hole for the amount of post below ground. Items 1 and 2 can easily be found in your order confirmation, but items 3 and 4 may be project and style specific. So let's discuss those individually in more detail before we jump into our calculation. Item number 3 was the gap under your fence panel and gate. You aren't going to install your fence or gate with the bottom of it sitting on the ground. You're going to leave a gap or space between the ground, driveway, walkway, and your fence or gate. We need to know that number as it will factor into our post depth calculation. For the fence panels, we want to be able to trim grass under the pickets without damaging the finish and be able to blow leaves and such under them as well. Gaps under fence panels typically run around 3 to 4 inches. However, it could vary for your specific project, such as the situations we discussed back in part 1. A 3 to 4 inch fence panel gap is a good starting guideline for your calculation. Be aware that the gaps under your fence panels may need to be slightly different in parts of the yard due to elevation changes or be next to a gate with a larger gap underneath it. Your gates can also utilize that 3 to 4 inch gap underneath number. But as I mentioned, gates may require a larger gap under them than the fence panels. Be sure to keep that in mind in relation to any fence panels coming off each side of the gate as well. You typically want to avoid a gate with a 4 inch gap under it and then a fence panel next to it with a 2 inch gap under it. Otherwise your gate is going to mount and stick up higher than the fence line. When calculating the gap under your gate, think about two things: winter compaction and slope throughout the gate swing's radius. If you get a lot of heavy winter snow and ice that gets compacted when it's walked on, you may want to go with a wider gap under the gate so it isn't jam stuck against compacted snow and ice in the winter. You also want to account for any crowns or slopes across the driveway or walkway that can affect your gate gap on each individual gate post to each side of the gate. If your driveway has a 2-inch crown in the middle and you want a 4-inch gap under the gate, then you need to factor the crown in to come up with the wider gap required at the post. Let me show you what I mean. As I mentioned, our example driveway has a 2-inch crown in the middle for water drainage, and you want a 4-inch gap under your gate. This means that we want a 4-inch gap under the gate here at the highest point in the middle where the peak of that crown is. What that also means is we need to account for the sides of the driveway being 2 inches lower to understand the true gap at the post where we're going to be calculating that post hole depth. So if I want a 4-inch gap under the high point of the crown in the middle, and it's 2 inches taller than the sides of the driveway, then we need to add the 4-inch desired gap at the crown plus the 2-inch height difference at the side of the driveway for a total 6-inch gap at the post. If we simply went with a 4-inch gap at the post and didn't account for the 2-inch crown in the driveway, that would mean that your installed gap at the post would be 4 inches and the installed gap at the crown would only be 2 inches. Now in this example, the install still worked. But if that had been a 5-inch crown in the driveway and we had a 4-inch gap at the post, then we'd have a problem. The 4-inch gap would be okay by the post, but the gate would hit the taller 5-inch crown by an inch in the middle of the driveway and interfere with the gate working. You also want to make those same considerations for any uphill slopes behind the gate in its swing radius. Your gate may clear in the closed position, but you want to make sure when the gate swings open, it's not hitting an uphill slope. You may only need a 4-inch gap here where the gate is closed, but need a 6.5-inch gap back here where the ground slopes up. In that case, your gate gap needs to be 6.5 inches at the post and not 4 inches, so the gate can use its full swing radius behind it. The fourth bit of information I mentioned was how much post you want above the fence top without the cap on it. This can vary by style of fence or your personal wants, but here are the guidelines we normally follow. If you have a fence panel style with a finial tips or hoop at the top and have a pretty flat yard, we recommend installing the fence so the tips of the fence panel line up to the top of the post without the post cap on, like this. So in this example, my amount of post or gap above the fence would be 0. If you have some elevations to deal with, or you want to leave yourself a little extra wiggle room, then make this measurement of post above the panel 1 to 2 inches if you're okay with the cap sitting up a little higher, or you want to go back and trim the post shorter later. Now those of you with eagle eyes may notice that my fence is slightly taller than the post top on my prop here. Even when I put something together, you can end up with something a little bit off. But whether I install a standard style cap, or I put on a ball cap, it will sit at or above the top of the fence finials and break up your line of sight and look okay if things aren't perfectly even like happened with my little prop here. That is where adding 1 to 2 inches of post above the fence along with the height of the post caps can come in real handy. It gives you some wiggle room if some of your posts don't end up sitting where you want them to, or the fence panel gets attached a little higher than you wanted it to. The cap being taller than the top of the fence panel is what you typically see. The post caps with the caps being shorter than the top of the fence is typically not. So in this instance, with my prop, our measurement for the post above panel would be 0 with the cap removed for a flat and level yard. If you're using a flat top fence like our pool style, then I would recommend a minimum 2-inch gap above the panel for this number if the yard is level. If we went with a 0 like our prop here, the rail and bracket would be up here and not allow our cap to slide on. Again, these are rough gap numbers and your particular project may use something different or be affected by those examples we reviewed back in part 1. Feel free to play around with the look by laying the pieces out on the ground. Whether you go with our suggestion or a modified one of your own, we just want to make sure that you know that gap spacing at the top and bottom of the panel before we get into your post step calculation. Our final item number 5 is to make sure you account for any of those special situations we discussed back in part 1. If you have a couple posts that are dealing with a slight elevation change or slope, then we need to make sure you're accounting for those differences in our upcoming depth calculations. That could mean some posts having larger or smaller top and bottom gap spacing. It could also mean that you may have multiple post depth numbers in your layout. It's rare that all of your post depths will be the same, as most yards do differ slightly across the property. All right, so now that we have those numbers for items 1 through 5 we just discussed, we can calculate our post hole depth. To get your post hole depth, you first add up the height of your fence panel or gate, plus your desired gap under the piece, plus your desired measurement of post above the piece without the cap, and then subtract it from your total post length. Let's look at an example for both a finial tip classic fence and a flat top pool fence. For our classic style example, let's say we have a 6-foot tall fence, 9-foot long posts, a 3-inch gap under the panel, and 0 inches between the top of post and fence panel. We first add up the fence panel height, gap under, and space above to get 6 foot 3 inches. We then subtract that from the 9-foot post total. So our 9-foot long post will have 6 foot 3 inches of post above ground and 2 foot 9 inches of it buried below ground. So your post hole depth in this example would be 2 foot 9 inches deep. Now, let's look at that same calculation with one of our flat top pool panels. For this example, we're installing a 4 foot 2 inch tall pool style panel that is flat on the top and flat on the bottom. It is being mounted on a 7 foot tall post. We want a 2-inch gap at the bottom and a 2-inch gap of space between the top of fence and post without the cap on. If we add up our fence panel, bottom gap, and space above post, we get a total of 4 foot 6 inches. We then subtract that from our 7 foot long post. So our 7 foot long post will have 4 foot 6 inches of the post above ground and 2 foot 6 inches of it buried below ground. So your post hole depth would be 2 foot 6 inches deep in this example. If your project has any of those special considerations we went over back in part 1, make sure you are taking those variances into account for the posts in those affected areas. For example, if you have a stair-step fence with a 6-inch rise over run drop down a hill and a desired 3-inch gap under all your panels in the flat areas, you need to make sure that you add that 6-inch slope change to the 3-inch desired gap to get a 9-inch gap under the panel for that downhill post here. Otherwise, your post may not be sticking up above the ground far enough for the top fence rail to attach to. Now that you've calculated your post hole width, post hole depth, and taken any special considerations into account, the sweating can begin as we roll into part 4, digging your post holes. Your manual post hole digging tool will be used in conjunction with the powered post hole auger you likely already rented. The manual tool can be used if your post holes need to be wider than the drilling head supplied with the power unit. Where the manual tools really come in handy is to fine-tune the final post hole size. The power digging units are not exactly precision tools. Here are a few pro tips to keep in mind as you begin digging your post holes. Start digging the post hole in the dead center of your spray painted marks on the grass, so you're hitting your correct on-center measurements that we calculated. Begin with an end or corner post in your layout. Your post hole should be situated so that you place the post in the center of the hole at level, its outer edge is touching against your string line. Be sure to dig your post hole down as straight as possible. If you live in an area that freezes heavily in the winter, digging a post hole that is wider at the top than it is at the bottom can allow for heaving of the post in deep freeze conditions. Keep the top of the post hole clean. Shovel loose dirt away from the top of the hole. You can then utilize a tape measure and a flat object at the top of your post hole, a metal ruler, a board, etc., and a tape measure to monitor the depth and width of the post hole as you proceed. Check your on-center post hole spacing as you go from post hole to post hole. Things can shift a little as you begin digging. Don't get too worried about perfection here. Just try to get as close as possible to your numbers. I can promise you, even the pros and experienced guys are never 100% perfect in the center of the dug hole. A little off is okay. If you find you accidentally dug the post hole too off-center, it is always better to widen the post hole and use some more concrete than allow the post not to have enough concrete around all 4 sides of it. If you accidentally dig too deep, add gravel, not loose dirt, to the bottom of your hole. Depending on your soil and drainage, it can be beneficial to overdig your post hole depth by 2 to 3 inches and add gravel at the bottom. The gravel will also allow for any water to drain away, and unlike loose dirt, it will not compact over time. Simply shovel or pour some gravel in the hole and tap it flat with the end of a board, level, something like that. The gravel in the post hole can also be another level of wiggle room in your post installation. Dig the post hole a little deeper and then use the gravel to fine-tune that final post hole depth. Hole ended up a little too deep and the post needs to be taller? Add some gravel. Post sticking up too far out of the ground? Scoop some gravel out of the hole. Gravel makes fine-tuning your above-ground post height much easier than trying to dig to perfection. All right, that was a long one with a lot of information, but we're making our way. In step 4, we looked to see if we need to take any special considerations into account for our posts, calculated how wide and deep our post holes needed to be, and began digging. In part 5, we'll go over setting the posts in concrete and getting our post caps installed. You can click this link to access the 8-step install series playlist. You can also visit us here at ironfenceshop.com. If you have any other questions, you can shoot us an email at sales@ironfenceshop.com or give us a call at 800-261-2729. We look forward to hearing from you.